The year was 1843. The effects of the Great Awakening had lasted well into the 1800s. Americans were a church-going people. It was a time when religious observance was by no means restricted to just attending church. The study of the Bible was an integral part of home life. Sometimes families traveled great distances to attend camp meetings and revivals. It was a time when conversions were commonplace and believers were spiritually renewed. One such group of believers was a small congregation from the Middle Creek Baptist Church, whose families had originally come from Bulletsburg Baptist Church. They lived between Big Bone Springs and south of Gunpowder Creek. In March of 1843, they met in a schoolhouse for the purpose of organizing a Baptist church. Because of their faith and foresight, these spirited and strong-willed pioneers had planted a seed that would eventually blossom into a new church. With the blessing of 7 churches from the association, the new church was to be constituted as the Big Bone Baptist Church. In April, the church was formally organized with 44 charter members. Early church minutes recorded 20 males, 21 females, and 3 black members. A Virginian named Robert Kirtley was Big Bone's first pastor. His family emigrated to Kentucky in 1796 and settled close to the community of Bulletsburg near the Ohio River. At 36, Robert Kirtley was ordained as a minister of the gospel by the Bulletsburg Church and became an active messenger for the North Bend Association. On May 25th, 1843, Robert Kirtley preached the introductory sermon. He was 57 years of age. In those days, it was common for pastors to serve more than one congregation, and while serving a neighboring church in Burlington, Reverend Kirtley agreed to accept the call to become the first pastor of Big Bone Church. In August, the church was officially received into the North Bend Association. For several years, the congregation continued to meet in the schoolhouse owned by General John Wallace. Each month, the congregation would meet on the 4th Saturday and Sunday. In June and October, the Lord's Supper was observed. In that first year, Thomas Huey and John C. Riley were ordained as the first 2 deacons. The church soon realized the need to build a house of worship. General John Wallace and his wife, Artemisia, sold 7 acres of their land to the church for $7 an acre and donated 2 additional acres. Total cost for the land was $35. In March of 1844, construction began for a house of worship. The church contracted Henry Sterncipher from Florence to build the new meeting house. Members pledged portions of their income. The women of the church raised money for chairs, tables, lamps, and books. The building took 2 years to complete and was ready to occupy in February of 1846. Nestled in a grove of maples, the new brick church measured 50 feet by 36 feet and a cost of $1,240. Church records tell us that a sum of $25.20 was allowed for a stove and other fixtures. Upon final completion, the building committee reported that it was paid for in full. The people now have a place to call home, a place where their families could come and worship together. At the close of the first year, the church had received 4 members by baptism and 5 by letter. 4 were dismissed, and 1 black member died. The congregation had also agreed to clear land for a cemetery and to build a vault for burial purposes. Today, we find many early church leaders buried in the old cemetery. Names like Huey, Mason, Hawkins, Hardesty, McCatton, just to name a few. Offerings for the first 2 years was $10.73. Expenses totaled $10.66, which left a balance in the church treasury of 7 cents. The North Bend Association met at Big Bone in July of 1846. In that same year, the church voted to raise funds for missions and to channel the money through the association for its use. By 1847, the membership had grown to 60 members. Pastor Robert Kirtley had this to say at the 1847 associational meeting. We rejoice to have it in our power to say that peace and harmony prevails with us, and we can but trust ere long the Lord will smile on this portion of our happy country and add to our number, as he will have to be saved. The first decade of the church's history was not without struggle. The church had survived a cholera epidemic and witnessed some dissension in the association. In those early days, it was a common practice for churches to purge the rolls, that is, to exclude members who had not regularly attended or had moved away. In 1848, a serious charge was placed against Sister Seeley, a slave of Samuel Huey, who attempted to poison her brother and his family. The church condemned her actions and excluded her from the church. Other members were, as the minutes reported, unbecoming in their conduct and were also excluded for various reasons. In 1848, the church ordained George H. Scott to the ministry, who had previously come from the Baptist Church of Christ in Burlington. Brother Scott assisted Reverend Kirtley, who was now in his 60s, with the ministry of the church and was instrumental in adding new converts. From 1849 through 1850, as many as 18 members were received and baptized. Just 3 years after his ordination, George Scott suddenly died at 44 years of age. An era had ended. By May 1853, the church had weathered some storms. Peace and good fellowship prevailed, and in just 10 years, Big Bone Baptist Church had grown to 73 members. By 1855, another revival spirit had swept across the land, and 39 new members were added to the church. Reverend James Kirtley, son of Reverend Robert Kirtley, had assumed the role of associate pastor and worked alongside his aging father, who was now in his 70s. Shortly after the death of Robert's wife, Reverend Robert Kirtley officially resigned his pastorate in 1859. He did, however, continue to preach for 13 more years until his death in 1872. On the heels of the Civil War, the church was now approaching the most critical period in her history. As in many congregations, there was a divided political sentiment among the members. The issues of the Civil War and slavery cast a dark cloud of fear over what once had been a peaceful community of believers. Throughout this period, the church was sobered by this deepening crisis. But under the leadership and counsel of Elder Robert Kirtley and other church leaders, its members had displayed a true spirit of tolerance and forbearance. The battle wounds slowly healed, and as the war finally came to an end, Big Bone's worst days were now behind. She was now poised for growth, and by 1868, the church had grown to 131 members. Both during and following the war years, Big Bone Church was instrumental in establishing other area churches and missions. Florence Baptist Church in 1855. The Hamilton and Grange Hall Missions, 1864. Walton Baptist Church, 1866. Beaver Lick in 1883. And Union in 1886. In the years following the Civil War, many of the charter and prominent members had died. The cemetery adjacent to the church was appropriately laid out in lots, and the vault was completed in 1883 at a cost of $537. New members were being added to the church. Special revival meetings were commonplace. Sunday school meetings were conducted every Sunday morning at the Union and Hamilton missions. The first mission school was the Sabbath School, organized in 1878 with 100 members regularly attending. Neighborhood prayer meetings were started, and revivals were held at the Big Bone Grange Hall, rented at a cost of $4 to the church. Big Bone Church grew steadily. In fact, it was not unusual to see 40 or more conversions at any one meeting. These services, sometimes called protracted meetings or camp meetings, would sometimes last for 2 or more weeks, with some services lasting far into the night. Baptisms took place in the Ohio River at Hamilton, Kentucky, and was a joyous event for families and friends. On one occasion, it was recorded that 18 heads of families and 2 entire households were baptized. In a 10-week period, nearly 100 people were baptized, and by 1883, the church had a total of 187 members. In April of 1887, the deacons of the church solicited pledges from members to pay the pastor's salary. Records show pastor salaries in those days averaged about $6 a week for each congregation he served. In 1888, S.M. Adams, O.M. Huey, and T.L. Oots were granted license to preach. Reverend Oots, nicknamed Tandy Lee, grew up in the Big Bone community and was elected clerk of Big Bone Church. In January 1889, at the age of 33, Reverend Oots was called to be pastor of East Bend Baptist Church. It's interesting to note that in the 1890s, the issue of drinking was addressed within the church. For several months, the church dealt with investigating brethren who were charged, as early records state, with the sin of drunkenness. A resolution was then adopted by the congregation giving guilty parties an opportunity to give an answer for the charge. The church demanded prompt and decisive action and excommunicated several members who did not abide by these moral codes. 1893 marked the 50th anniversary of the church. This Jubilee meeting honored the only two surviving original charter members. They were Dr. Samuel Hawkins and J.T. Mason. The church was rapidly growing, and by 1894 it had 248 members. In that same year, 72-year-old Reverend James Kirtley submitted his resignation as pastor. He had faithfully served the church for nearly 43 years. He was a well-loved and respected pastor. The congregation begged Reverend Kirtley to withdraw his resignation and to continue as pastor. After prayerful consideration, James Kirtley did withdraw his resignation, and he served the church for 6 more years until his accepted resignation in 1900. He served Big Bone Baptist Church for 49 years, a most remarkable record, and he died 4 years later at the age of 82. One of the most unique landmarks still standing today is the Rock Wall, built in 1897. It was a coddling place for crying babies, a playground for children, and a place for conversation among the old-timers. Ladies in long skirts and petticoats would step from a horse or buggy onto the wall. A story is told that several pastors of Big Bone Church would bring up the subject of tearing down that bothersome object. During revivals and other services, the rock wall became a favorite bench to a lot of men who came to church, but didn't always occupy a pew in the church. At the turn of the century, W.S. Taylor was called as pastor in 1901 and served until 1903. Leighton Maddox served from 1904 through 1906. J.T. Betts came as pastor in 1906 and served for 1 year. In September of 1906, the church agreed to build a parsonage next to the church. It was completed the next year at a cost of $1,500. That same year, the church's Committee on Discipline was officially disbanded. In July of 1907, the church voted to replace fermented wine with sweet wine in celebrating the Lord's Supper. William McMillan became Big Bone's 6th pastor in 1908 and served for 6 years. Under McMillan's ministry, the great Roll Call Day was initiated with dinners served on the grounds. At this homecoming event, members would attend a special service and answer when their names were called. In 1911, the first Wednesday night prayer meeting was held. In 1915, Albert Maddox became pastor and served until 1917. Under Reverend Maddox, a Sunday school was organized at the Hamilton Schoolhouse, and 41 conversions were reported in a 17-day revival meeting. In the early 1900s, the tent meeting became an effective way of reaching people with the gospel. Big Bone Springs was a popular site for many of these meetings. Traveling evangelists like J.P. Jenkins and O.M. Huey of Louisville were favorite speakers of the day. J.E. Myers was called as pastor in 1917, but declined the invitation. Reverend E.T. Mangum accepted the call in March 1918. He served for only 1 year. In 1919, O.C. Payton of Pembroke, Kentucky was called as the church's 9th pastor. He also served for just 1 year. J.A. Miller became pastor in 1920 and served until 1922. In 1923, J.M. Broom was also called, but declined the invitation. A Baptist Young People's Union was organized under Reverend O.G. Tillman, who was pastor from 1923 to 1924. In the summer of 1923, a resolution was adopted regarding giving to the church. Any member who does not support the church financially within 6 months of this date and regularly thereafter shall be placed on a drop list after investigation and recommended by a committee appointed by the church. C.J. Avery was pastor from 1924 through 1926. His salary was $20 a week. In September of 1926, Big Bone called Roy Johnson to be its 13th pastor. An Army veteran of World War I, he served Big Bone Church for 15 years. It was said that Roy Johnson had preached at every Baptist church within a 50-mile radius of Florence. Sam Branham became pastor in 1941 and served until 1943. World War II had called 37 of our young men away for military duty, and a special board with the names of those individuals was placed in the sanctuary. By God's grace, all 37 servicemen returned home safely. 1943 marked 100 years in the church's history. Miss Lillian Bristow was given the authority to prepare a church history. Big Bone celebrated this special event on the 5th Sunday in May of that year. Total church membership at that time was 350 members. In 1944, Sam Hogan was called to be pastor. His salary was $25 a week. Under his ministry, the first vacation Bible school was held in the summer of 1945. Harold Wainscott was our 16th pastor. He came in April of 1949 and served until 1952. Under his ministry, a church council was formally organized. In 1952, J.R. McClure was called to be pastor at a salary of $45 a week. He served until 1957. 7 new Sunday school rooms were added in the rear of the church at a cost not to exceed $5,500. A church bus was purchased for $225 and a baptismal pool was completed. James Armstrong was pastor beginning in 1958 and served until 1965. Robert Ginn was called as pastor in 1965 and served for 10 years. In the 1960s, society was fueled by the winds of change. Churches, although not changing the gospel message, responded to the changing society. Ministry became a broader term and was not restricted to just the pastor. People became involved in doing different kinds of ministries. A strong emphasis on youth programs became a vital part of the church, and Sunday school attendance had reached an all-time high. In 1965, the church voted to build a new brick parsonage. In 1968, Big Bone Church celebrated her 125th anniversary with a traditional roll call and homecoming. Music has always been a vital part of our church. In 1970, the Big Bone Quartet began a music ministry which continues to this day. Joe Beal became our first full-time music director in 1970 and also was interim pastor from 1975 to 1976. Terry Jones also served in 1971 as minister of music. Our 21st pastor was Robert Shetler Sr., who came in 1976 and served until 1984. Just prior to his coming, the old sanctuary was remodeled, but the old sanctuary was showing signs of old age. The interior walls, made of sun-baked bricks, were beginning to slowly deteriorate. Chris Barnett was called as our 22nd pastor in 1984 and served until 1987. Under his ministry, a children's church was organized and support was given to the Boone County Community Action Commission. Our pastor, Michael Jones, came in 1988. Since his coming, ACTEENs, GAs, and RAs have been organized. A food pantry was established, and an innovative truck stop ministry has been a means of outreach to the community and area. On February 10th, 1992, the old church became a victim of progress. Local preservationists fought to save it, but the time eventually came for it to come down. Longtime member Francis Gruelle said, "That old church building has been my whole life, but sometimes you have to put things behind you." With mixed feelings, the congregation voted 141 to nothing to tear down the old sanctuary. The building was more than just bricks and mortar. It reflected beliefs and values of a bygone era, a time of simplicity and the need to worship. It stood for 146 years and was a tribute to those 44 founding members whose sweat, love, and determination built its walls. A new $500,000 facility was built in 1991. A year later, January 26, 1992, the first service was held in the new building. It houses 14 Sunday school rooms, a spacious fellowship hall, and a 450-seat sanctuary. Spotless white walls and bright chandeliers have created an inviting environment for worship and fellowship. Big Bone Baptist Church has a unique history. A history that calls each one of us to go forward and complete the good work that God has called each one of us to do. That good work, which began 150 years ago, continues today in a new generation. Our cherished past is one of not only sacrifice and struggle, but a past that reminds us that God's amazing grace is always faithful. As God is still faithful today, our response is to remain faithful to His call to serve, as was first realized in the vision of those early pioneers. May our faith, foresight, and spirit be as sincere and determined as those first 44 members. May we always treasure our heritage and together be challenged to boldly face the future as we continue to share the good news of God's love.
He who began a good work in you, He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. He'll be faithful to complete it. He who started the work will be faithful to complete it in you. He who began a good work in you, He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. He'll be faithful to complete it. He who started the work will be faithful to complete it in you. He who began a good work in you, He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. He'll be faithful to complete it. He who started the work will be faithful to complete it in you. He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. He'll be faithful to complete it. He who started the work will be faithful to complete it.